6 condemned men wheel a stretcher toward the exit of Virginia's most secure prison. On top of it, hidden under a blanket, sits what everyone believes is a bomb about to go off. They're wearing guard uniforms and riot helmets. No one can see their faces. No one stops them. Within minutes, 6 of the most feared killers on death row will roll through 2 locked gates and vanish into the night. And the prison that was sworn to be escape-proof will become a national punchline. When the Mecklenburg Correctional Center opened its doors in the late 1970s near the small town of Boynton, Virginia, it was sold to the public as a fortress. $20 million. State-of-the-art technology. A place built to hold the worst criminals in the state, including its death row. At the ribbon cutting, the governor promised the prison would seal, once and for all, the bond between crime and its punishment. Everyone kept repeating the same word, escape-proof. On May 31st, 1984, that word fell apart. To understand what happened that night, you first have to know the men who made it possible. And above all, 2 brothers, Linwood and James Briley. In the late 1970s, the Brileys had spread terror across Richmond, Virginia. Together with their younger brother Anthony and an accomplice named Duncan Meekins, they carried out a stretch of crimes so brutal, it barely made sense. Over several months in 1979, the gang left a trail of death behind them. They're believed to be responsible for at least 11 murders in the Richmond area. Killings carried out with a coldness that unsettled even veteran investigators. These weren't robberies gone wrong. They were calculated, senseless, chosen. The fear they spread was a particular kind. Many of their victims had no connection to them at all. Ordinary people picked almost at random, unlucky enough to cross their path at the wrong moment. Among the dead were neighbors and even well-known figures around the city, including a local radio disc jockey. For roughly 7 months, Richmond lived with the sense that anyone could be next, that death could knock on any door for no reason and with no warning. When the gang finally fell, the city exhaled. No one imagined that 5 years later, 2 of those names would be back on the front pages. When they were caught, justice dealt out very different fates. Duncan Meekins took a deal with prosecutors and testified against the brothers. It was his testimony, more than anything, that made the convictions of all 3 Brileys possible. Anthony got life. But for Linwood and James, the proof that they had killed with their own hands was overwhelming. Both were sentenced to death. In early 1980, they arrived at Mecklenburg's death row to wait for the electric chair. In theory, that was the end of the story. Mecklenburg's death row was designed for extreme isolation, men locked down almost around the clock under constant watch, with nothing on the horizon but the countdown to their own execution. Escaping from there simply didn't exist as a possibility. And that certainty, that absolute confidence that no one could break the system, may have been the first crack. Because when everyone agrees something is impossible, sooner or later they stop watching it as closely. Most men in that situation give up. The Brileys did not. By every account, the mastermind was Linwood. In 1984, he was 30 years old with a dangerous blend of charisma, intelligence, and complete disregard for human life. He could read people, he could lead, and he could wait. His brother James, 2 years younger, was quieter and colder, but he followed Linwood without question. Recruiting accomplices wasn't hard. When every man around you already has an execution date, the word risk loses its meaning. 4 more condemned men joined the brothers: Earl Clanton, Derek Peterson, Willie Leroy Jones, and Lem Tuggle. 6 men with absolutely nothing left to lose. And that, in the end, was their greatest weapon. An ordinary inmate weighs risks. He thinks about the years he could add to his sentence, the punishments, everything he could still lose. A man condemned to death has already lost everything that could be taken from him. The threat that props up the entire order of a prison, misbehave, and there are consequences, simply had no grip on these men, and 6 of them in that frame of mind, organized and patient, were far more dangerous than any spur-of-the-moment riot. For months, the Brileys studied the prison the way you'd study for the most important exam of your life. They watched the guards, their routines, their shifts, their habits. right down to their gestures and their tics. They learned where the blind spots were and when the staff let their guard down, and with a clockmaker's patience, they began building weapons, turning garden tools into homemade knives, sharpened and lethal, hidden away until the right moment. They rehearsed the sequence in their minds until every step had its place and its timing. Almost nothing about that night would be left to improvisation. That moment almost never came. Months earlier, other inmates had warned officials about a possible escape plan. The prison responded with a general lockdown that dragged on for weeks. But under pressure from human rights groups and the bureaucracy itself, the lockdown was lifted just before summer. The door that suspicion had closed, routine swung open again, and then came the night of May 31st. The first to move was Earl Clanton. As the inmates were heading back to their cells for the night, Clanton slipped out of line and ducked into a bathroom right next to the control room, the heart of the security system. He locked himself inside, silent, unnoticed by any guard. He was a piece placed on the board in advance. Around 10 o'clock, James Briley approached the control room and asked for something as harmless as a paperback book left in a locked day room. The officer on duty, suspecting nothing, moved to help him. That was the instant they'd been waiting for. Clanton burst out of the bathroom, and together he and James overpowered the officer and seized the control room. From there, everything changed. They began working the switches that opened the cells and the doors of the block. In seconds, death row was wide open. The 6 conspirators moved with a coordination that only months of planning can buy. One by one, they subdued the guards who appeared. They disarmed them, stripped them, tied them up, and locked them in the cells they had just emptied. In all, they took roughly 12 officers and 2 nurses hostage, holding them for about an hour and a half. Then came the disguise. The inmates pulled on the guards' uniforms. The idea was simple and brilliant. If they passed as staff, they could lure the rest of the officers into the trap and take control of the entire building. Every time a guard walked in, they were waiting with the homemade knives, and another hostage was added to the pile. And here is the most human and most unsettling detail of the whole story. In the middle of the chaos, the Brileys wanted to go further. According to records and later testimony, they proposed killing the guards outright, dousing them with rubbing alcohol and setting them on fire, but not every man on death row was willing to go that far. 2 inmates who were not part of the escape plan, Wilbert Lee Evans and Willie Lloyd Turner, stepped in. Turner physically blocked James Briley. Evans stopped Linwood from attacking one of the nurses and calmed the men who were hungry for revenge against the staff. Because of them, all 14 hostages came out without serious injury. Years later, several of those guards would testify that Evans had saved their lives. That fact carries weight, because both Evans and Turner were eventually executed anyway for their own earlier crimes, despite what they did that night. With the building under control, one thing remained: getting out. And for that, the Brileys staged something almost impossible to believe. They needed a pretext that would make the prison itself open the gates for them. They found it in fear. When a higher-ranking officer entered the unit, they ambushed him and pressed a knife to his throat. With the blade against his neck, they forced him to grab the radio and put out a false message. There was a bomb inside the death row building, and it had to be removed at once before it went off. He also asked that a van be sent to the rear of the unit to carry the device safely away. On the other end of the radio, no one doubted him. Meanwhile, the 6 were building their bomb. They raided a storeroom and pulled on riot gear, helmets included so no one could recognize their faces. They set a television on a stretcher and covered it with a blanket. They grabbed fire extinguishers too, the extra touch that made the scene even more convincing. 6 figures in uniform and helmets, urgently hauling a covered bundle and emergency equipment. The perfect picture of a bomb squad doing its job. They pushed the stretcher down the corridors toward the rear exit. The guards they passed didn't see inmates, they saw colleagues handling an emergency. No one stopped them. No one asked them to identify themselves. The van was waiting at the back exactly where they'd ordered it, but one last obstacle remained, and it nearly wrecked everything. To leave the grounds, they had to clear 2 gates, and those gates were controlled by a guard up in a tower. She had watched them load the so-called bomb into the vehicle, and something didn't sit right with her. She hesitated, For a moment, the entire escape hung on that doubt. And in the end, she did what her training and the manufactured urgency told her to do. She opened the gates and let the van through. 6 death row inmates were on the outside. It wasn't until a while later that the staff at Mecklenburg understood what had happened. By then, the van was already rolling toward neighboring North Carolina. The fugitives had a few $100s on them, lifted from the pockets of the guards they'd subdued. And they had a plan. Reach Canada, a country that rejected the death penalty and would be unlikely to hand over men who'd be sent back to die. What followed was one of the largest manhunts of the era. The state of Virginia went into a panic. For nearly 3 weeks, the mere thought of the Briley brothers loose kept whole communities locked behind their doors. Every rumor, every noise, every strange car became an alarm. The fear didn't stop at Virginia's borders. As word spread that the fugitives were heading north, the unease rippled up into Vermont and even into southern Quebec in Canada. In those quiet towns, hundreds of miles from where the crimes began, people started talking about the same thing that obsessed Richmond. The press gave it a name that said it all: the Briley Jitters. Rarely had the trail of 2 men held so many communities on edge at once, scattered across such a vast stretch of country. Police checkpoints went up. Tips poured in from 3 states and a foreign country, and every sighting had to be chased down before it went cold. The first to fall were the most hurried. Earl Clanton and Derek Peterson were caught the very next day at a self-service laundromat in Warrenton, North Carolina. Lem Tuggle and Willie Leroy Jones got much farther. They nearly touched their dream of crossing into Canada, but were stopped in Vermont, just short of the border, and held at a facility in Rutland to await extradition. The Briley brothers were the hardest. They moved carefully and split off from the rest, eventually taking shelter in North Philadelphia, near an uncle, confident they could blend in. The capture of the others was in part what finally doomed them. With each piece that fell, investigators pieced together where the brothers had gone. They knew the Brileys had family around Philadelphia, and they concentrated the search there. An intercepted phone call marked the exact spot. The net, which at first seemed impossible to close around 2 such careful men, tightened street by street. Roughly 19 days after the escape, an FBI team backed by local police closed in on the hideout. The Brileys were arrested without resistance. With that, all 6 men were back behind bars. The largest death row escape in United States history had lasted, at its longest, less than 3 weeks. The end for each of them was the one the law had written from the start. All 6 were executed. Linwood Briley died in the electric chair in October 1984, just months after his feat. His brother James followed in April 1985. Earl Clanton was executed in 1988, Derek Peterson in 1991, Willie Leroy Jones in 1992. The last to die was Lem Tuggle in December 1996. Before receiving the lethal injection, he left behind a line that landed cold, given the season. His final words were "Merry Christmas." 12 years had passed since the escape, and one by one, the fortress had reclaimed every man who beat it. The escape left deep scars on Virginia's prison system. The investigation that followed was brutal. Corrections officials spoke of a complete breakdown in the conduct of the staff that night, and the guards themselves, furious at being turned into scapegoats, went public with their side of the story. A chain of failures came to light. Warnings ignored, lax searches that let weapons and materials be hidden, privileges that allowed the inmates to move around far too freely. The fortress had not been beaten by force, but by the sum of small oversights piled up over months. Mecklenburg, the unbreakable stronghold, went down in history for the night. 6 men defeated it without forcing a single lock, simply by understanding, perfectly, how fear and routine worked in the men who were supposed to guard them. Controls were tightened, leadership changed, and years later, the prison itself finally closed for good. Because that may be the most uncomfortable lesson of this whole story. The high walls, the thick bars, the $20 million, none of them failed. What failed was human, and no fortress, no matter how flawless it's advertised to be, is ever stronger than the weakest link among the people who watch over it. who watch